Chapter 28, Part 2 of Melmoth the Wanderer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin. Chapter 28, Part 2. Inez, still incredulous, yet imagining that to soothe his delirium was perhaps the best way to overcome it, demanded what that condition was. Though they were alone, Walberg would communicate it only in a whisper, and Inez, fortified as she was by reason hitherto undisturbed and a cool and steady temper, could not but recollect some vague reports, as she had heard in her early youth, before she quitted Spain, of a being permitted to wander through it with power to tempt men under the pressure of extreme calamity with similar offers, which had been invariably rejected, even in the last extremities of despair and dissolution. She was not superstitious, but, her memory now taking part with her husband's representation of what had befallen him, she shuddered at the possibility of his being exposed to similar temptation, and she endeavored to fortify his mind and conscience by arguments equally appropriate, whether he was the victim of a disturbed imagination or the real object of this fearful persecution. She reminded him that if, even in Spain, where the abominations of Antichrist prevailed, and the triumph of the mother of witchcrafts and spiritual seduction was complete, the fearful offer he alluded to had been made and rejected with such unmitigated abhorrence, the renunciation of one who had embraced the pure doctrines of the gospel should be expressed with a tenfold energy of feeling and holy defiance. "You," said the heroic woman, "you first taught me that the doctrines of salvation are to be found alone in the Holy Scriptures. I believed you, and wedded you in that belief. We are united less in the body than in the soul, for in the body neither of us may probably sojourn much longer. You pointed out to me, not the legends of fabulous saints, but the lives of the primitive apostles and martyrs of the true church. There I read no tales of voluntary humility, of self-inflicted fruitless sufferings, but I read that the people of God were destitute, afflicted, tormented. And shall we dare to murmur at following the examples of those you have pointed out to me as ensamples of suffering? They bore the spoiling of their goods, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, they resisted unto blood, striving against sin. And shall we lament the lot that has fallen to us, when our hearts have so often burned within us, as we read the holy records together? Alas, what avails feeling till it is brought to the test of fact? How we deceived ourselves in believing that we indeed participated in the feelings of those holy men, while we were so far removed from the test by which they were proved. We read of imprisonments, of tortures, and of flames. We closed the book and partook of a comfortable meal, and retired to a peaceful bed, triumphing in the thought, while saturated with all the world's good, that if their trials had been ours, we could have sustained those trials as they did. Now our hour has come. It is an hour sharp and terrible. It is, murmured the shuddering husband. But shall we therefore shrink? Replied his wife. Your ancestors, who were the first in Germany that embraced the Reformed religion, have bled and blazed for it, as you have often told me. Can there be a stronger attestation to it? I believe there can, said Walberg, whose eyes rolled fearfully, that of starving for it. Oh, Inez, he exclaimed as he grasped her hands convulsively, I still feel that a death at the stake would be mercy compared to the lingering tortures of protracted famine. To the death that we die daily, and yet do not die. What is this I hold? He exclaimed, grasping unconsciously the hand he held in his. It is my hand, my love, answered the trembling wife. Yours? No, impossible. Your fingers were soft and cool, but these are dry. Is this a human hand? It is mine, said the weeping wife. Then you must have been famishing, said Walberg, awakening as if from a dream. We have all been so latterly, answered Inez, satisfied to restore her husband's sanity, even at the expense of this horrible confession. We have all been so, but I have suffered the least. When a family is famishing, the children think of their meals, but the mother thinks only of her children. I have lived on as little as I could. I had indeed no appetite. Hush, said Walberg, interrupting her. What sound was that? Was it not like a dying groan? No, it is the children who moan in their sleep. What do they moan for? Hunger, I believe, said Inez, involuntarily yielding to the dreadful conviction of habitual misery. And I sit and hear this, said Walberg, starting up. I sit to hear their young sleep broken by dreams of hunger, while for a word's speaking I could pile this floor with mountains of gold, and all for the risk of what? Said Inez, clinging to him. Of what? Oh, think of that. What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Oh, let us starve, die, rot before your eyes, rather than you should seal your perdition by that horrible— Hear me, woman, said Walberg, turning on her eyes almost as fierce and lustrous as those of Melmoth, and whose light indeed seemed borrowed from his. Hear me, my soul is lost. They who die in the agonies of famine know no God, and want none. If I remain here to famish among my children, I shall as surely blaspheme the author of my being as I shall renounce him under the fearful conditions proposed to me. Listen to me, Inez, and tremble not. To see my children die of famine will be to me instant suicide and impenitent despair. But if I close with this fearful offer, I may yet repent, I may yet escape. There is hope on one side, on the other there is none, none, none. Your hands cling round me, but their touch is cold. You are wasted to a shadow with want. Show me the means of procuring another meal, and I will spit at the tempter and spurn him. But where is that to be found? Let me go, then, to meet him. You will pray for me, Inez, will you not? And the children? No, let them not pray for me. In my despair I forgot to pray myself, and their prayers would now be a reproach to me. Inez, Inez, what? Am I talking to a corse? He was indeed, for the wretched wife had sunk at his feet senseless. Thank God, he again emphatically exclaimed as he beheld her lie to all appearance lifeless before him. Thank God, a word then has killed her. It was a gentler death than famine. It would have been kind to have strangled her with these hands. Now for the children, he exclaimed, while horrid thoughts chased each other over his reeling and unseated mind, and he imagined he heard the roar of a sea in its full strength thundering in his ears, and saw 10,000 waves dashing at his feet, and every wave of blood. Now for the children, and he felt about as if for some implement of destruction. In doing so, his left hand crossed his right, and grasping it, he exclaimed as if he felt a sword in his hand, This will do, they will struggle, they will supplicate, but I will tell them their mother lies dead at my feet, and then what can they say? How now, said the miserable man, sitting calmly down, if they cry to me, what shall I answer? Julia and Inez, her mother's namesake, and poor little Maurice, who smiles even amid hunger, and whose smiles are worse than curses, I will tell them their mother is dead, he cried, staggering towards the door of his children's apartment. Dead without a blow, that shall be their answer and their doom. As he spoke, he stumbled over the senseless body of his wife, and the tone of his mind once more strung up to the highest pitch of conscious agony. He cried, Men, men, what are your pursuits and your passions, your hopes and fears, your struggles and your triumphs? Look on me. Learn from a human being like yourselves, who preaches his last and fearful sermon over the corse of his wife, and approaching the bodies of his sleeping children, whom he soon hopes to see corses also, corses made so by his own hand. Let all the world listen to me. Let them resign factitious wants and wishes, and furnish those who hang on them for subsistence with the means of bare subsistence. There is no care, no thought beyond this. Let our children call on me for instruction, for promotion, for distinction, and call in vain. I hold myself innocent. They may find those for themselves or want them if they list, but let them never in vain call on me for bread, as they have done, as they do now. I hear the moans of their hungry sleep. World, world, be wise, and let your children curse you to your face for anything but want of bread. Oh, that is the bitterest of curses, and it is felt most when it is least uttered. I have felt it often, but I shall feel it no longer." And the wretch tottered towards the beds of his children. "Father, father," cried Julia, "are these your hands? Oh, let me live, and I will do anything but father, dear father," cried Ines, "spare us. Tomorrow may bring another meal." Maurice, the young child, sprung from his bed and cried, clinging round his father, "Oh, dear father, forgive me, but I dreamed a wolf was in the room and was tearing out our throats, and father, I cried so long that I thought you never would come, and now, oh God," as he felt the hands of the frantic wretch grasping his throat, "are you the wolf?" Fortunately those hands were powerless from the very convulsion of the agony that prompted their desperate effort. The daughters had swooned from horror, and their swoon appeared like death. The child had the cunning to counterfeit death also, and lay extended and stopping his breath under the fierce but faltering grip that seized his young throat, then relinquished, then grasped it again, and then relaxed its hold, as at the expiration of a spasm. When all was over, as the wretched father thought, he retreated from the chamber. In doing so, he stumbled over the corse-like form of his wife. A groan announced that the sufferer was not dead. "What does this mean?" said Walberg, staggering in his delirium. "Does the corse reproach me for murder, or does one surviving breath curse me for the unfinished work?" As he spoke, he placed his foot on his wife's body. At this moment a loud knock was heard at the door. "They are come," said Walberg, whose frenzy hurried him rapidly through the scenes of an imaginary murder, and the consequence of a judicial process. "Well, come in, knock again, or lift the latch, or enter as ye list. Here I sit amid the bodies of my wife and children. I have murdered them, I confess it. Ye come to drag me to torture, I know, but never, never can your tortures inflict on me more than the agony of seeing them perish by hunger before my eyes. Come in, the deed is done, the corse of my wife is at my foot, and the blood of my children is on my hands. What have I further to fear?" But while the wretched man spoke thus, he sunk sullenly on his chair, appearing to be employed in wiping from his fingers the traces of blood with which he imagined they were stained. At length the knocking at the door became louder, the latch was lifted, and 3 figures entered the apartment in which Walberg sat. They advanced slowly, 2 from age and exhaustion, and the third from strong emotion. Walberg heeded them not, his eyes were fixed, his hands locked in each other, nor did he move a limb as they approached. "Do you not know us?" said the foremost, holding up a lantern which he held in his hand. Its light fell on a group worthy the pencil of a Rembrandt. The room lay in complete darkness, except where that strong and unbroken light fell. It glared on the rigid and moveless obduracy of Walberg's despair, who appeared stiffening into stone as he sat. It showed the figure of the friendly priest who had been Guzman's director, and whose features, pale and haggard with age and austerity, seemed to struggle with the smile that trembled over their wrinkled lines. Behind him stood the aged father of Walberg, with an aspect of perfect apathy, except when, with a momentary effort at recollection, he shook his white head, seeming to ask himself why he was there, and wherefore he could not speak. Supporting him stood the young form of Everhard, over whose cheek and eye wandered a glow and lustre too bright to last, and instantly succeeded by paleness and dejection. He trembled, advanced, then shrinking back, clung to his infirm grandfather, as if needing the support he appeared to give. Walberg was the first to break the silence. "I know ye who ye are," he said hollowly. "Ye are come to seize me. Ye have heard my confession. Why do you delay? Drag me away. I would rise and follow you if I could, but I feel as if I had grown to this seat. You must drag me from it yourselves." As he spoke, his wife, who had remained stretched at his feet, rose slowly but firmly, and of all that she saw or heard, appearing to comprehend only the meaning of her husband's words, she clasped her arms round him as if to oppose his being torn from her, and gazed on the group with a look of impotent and ghastly defiance. "Another witness," cried Walberg, "risen from the dead against me. Nay, then, it is time to be gone," and he attempted to rise. "Stay, father," said Everhard, rushing forward and detaining him in his seat. "Stay, there is good news, and this good priest has come to tell it. Listen to him, father, I cannot speak. You, oh you, Everhard, answered the father, with a look of mournful reproach, you, a witness against me too. I never raised my hand against you. Those whom I murdered are silent, and will you be my accuser? They all now gathered round him, partly in terror and partly in consolation, all anxious to disclose to him the tidings with which their hearts were burdened, yet fearful lest the freight might be too much for the frail vessel that rocked and reeled before them, as if the next breeze would be like a tempest to it. At last it burst forth from the priest, who, by the necessities of his profession, was ignorant of domestic feelings and of the felicities and agonies which are inseparably twined with the fibres of conjugal and parental hearts. He knew nothing of what Walberg might feel as a husband or father, for he could never be either, but he felt that good news must be good news, into whatever ears they were poured, or by whatever lips they might be uttered. We have the will, he cried abruptly, the true will of Guzman. The other was, asking pardon of God and the saints for saying so, no better than a forgery. The will is found, and you and your family are heirs to all his wealth. I was coming to acquaint you, late as it was, having with difficulty obtained the Superior's permission to do so, and in my way I met this old man, whom your son was conducting. How came he out so late? At these words Walberg was observed to shudder with a brief but strong spasm. The will is found, repeated the priest, perceiving how little effect the words seemed to have on Walberg. And he raised his voice to its utmost pitch. The will of my uncle is found, repeated Everhard. Found, 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 echoed the aged grandfather, not knowing what he said, but vaguely repeating the last words he heard, and then looking round as if asking for an explanation of them. The will is found, love, cried Inez, who appeared restored to sudden and perfect consciousness by the sound. Do you not hear, love? We are wealthy, we are happy. Speak to us, love, and do not stare so vacantly. Speak to us. A long pause followed. At length, who are those? Said Walberg in a hollow voice, pointing to the figures before him, whom he viewed with a fixed and ghastly look, as if he was gazing on a band of spectres. Your son, love, and your father, and the good friendly priest. Why do you look so doubtfully on us? And what do they come for? Said Walberg. Again and again the import of their communication was told him, in tones that, trembling with varied emotions, scarce could express their meaning. At length he seemed faintly conscious of what was said, and looking round on them, uttered a long and heavy sigh. They ceased to speak, and watched him in silence. Wealth, wealth! It comes too late. Look here, and he pointed to the room where his children lay. Inez, with a dreadful presentiment at her heart, rushed into it, and beheld her daughters lying apparently lifeless. The shriek she uttered as she fell on the bodies brought the priest and her son to her assistance, and Walberg and the old man were left together alone, viewing each other with looks of complete insensibility. And this apathy of age and stupefaction of despair made a singular contrast with the fierce and wild agony of those who still retained their feelings. It was long before the daughters were recovered from their death-like swoon, and still longer before their father could be persuaded that the arms that clasped him and the tears that fell on his cold cheek were those of his living children. All that night his wife and family struggled with his despair. At last recollection seemed to burst on him at once. He shed some tears, then with a minuteness of reminiscence that was equally singular and affecting, he flung himself before the old man, who, speechless and exhausted, sat passively in his chair, and exclaiming, "Father, forgive me," buried his head between his father's knees. Happiness is a powerful restorative. In a few days the spirits of all appeared to have subsided into a calm. They wept sometimes, but their tears were no longer painful. They resembled those showers in a fine spring morning, which announced the increasing warmth and beauty of the day. The infirmities of Walberg's father made the son resolve not to leave Spain till his dissolution, which took place in a few months. He died in peace, blessing and blessed. His son was his only spiritual attendant, and a brief and partial interval of recollection enabled him to understand and express his joy and confidence in the holy texts which were read to him from the Scriptures. The wealth of the family had now given them importance, and by the interest of the friendly priest, the body was permitted to be interred in consecrated ground. The family then set out for Germany, where they reside in prosperous felicity. But to this hour Walberg shudders with horror when he recalls the fearful temptations of the stranger whom he met in his nightly wanderings in the hour of his adversity, and the horrors of this visitation appear to oppress his recollection more than even the images of his family perishing with want. "There are other narratives," continued the stranger, "relating to this mysterious being, which I am in possession of, and which I have collected with much difficulty, for the unhappy who are exposed to his temptations consider their misfortunes as a crime, and conceal with the most anxious secrecy every circumstance of this horrible visitation. Should we again meet, Signor, I may communicate them to you, and you will find them no less extraordinary than that I have just related. But it is now late, and you need repose after the fatigue of your journey." So saying, the stranger departed. Don Francisco remained seated in his chair, musing on the singular tale he had listened to till the lateness of the hour, combining with his fatigue and the profound attention he had paid to the narrative of the stranger, plunged him insensibly into a deep slumber. He was awoke in a few minutes by a slight noise in the room, and looking up, perceived seated opposite to him another person, whom he never recollected to have seen before, but who was indeed the same who had been refused admittance under the roof of that house the preceding day. He appeared seated perfectly at his ease, however, and to Don Francisco's look of surprise and inquiry replied that he was a traveller who had been by mistake shown into that apartment; that finding its occupant asleep and undisturbed by his entrance, he had taken the liberty of remaining there, but was willing to retire if his presence was considered intrusive. As he spoke, Don Francisco had leisure to observe him. There was something remarkable in his expression, though the observer did not find it easy to define what it was; and his manner, though not courtly or conciliating, had an ease which appeared more the result of independence of thought than of the acquired habitudes of society. Don Francisco welcomed him gravely and slowly, not without a sensation of awe, for which he could scarcely account, and the stranger returned the salutation in a manner that was not likely to diminish that impression. A long silence followed. The stranger, who did not announce his name, was the first to break it, by apologizing for having, while seated in an adjacent apartment, involuntarily overheard an extraordinary tale or narrative related to Don Francisco, in which he confessed he took a profound interest, such as, he added, bowing with an air of grim and reluctant civility, would, he trusted, palliate his impropriety in listening to a communication not addressed to him. To all this Don Francisco could only reply by bows equally rigid, his body scarce forming an acute angle with his limbs as he sat, and by looks of uneasy and doubtful curiosity directed towards his strange visitor, who, however, kept his seat immovably, and seemed, after all his apologies, resolved to sit out Don Francisco. Another long pause was broken by the visitor. "You were listening, I think," he said, "to a wild and terrible story of a being who was commissioned on an unutterable errand, even to tempt spirits in woe at their last mortal extremity, to barter their hopes of future happiness for a short remission of their temporary sufferings." "I heard nothing of that," said Don Francisco, whose recollection, none of the clearest naturally, was not much improved by the length of the narrative he had just listened to. and by the sleep into which he had fallen since he heard it. "Nothing?" said the visitor, with something of abruptness and asperity in his tone that made the hearers start. "Nothing. I thought there was mention too of that unhappy being to whom Walberg confessed his severest trials were owing, in comparison whose fearful visitations, those of even famine, were as dust in the balance." "Yes, yes," answered Don Francisco, startled into sudden recollection. "I remember there was a mention of the devil, or his agent, or something." "Senhor," said the stranger, interrupting him with an expression of wild and fierce derision, which was lost on Aliaga, "Senhor, I beg you will not confound personages who have the honour to be so nearly allied, and yet so perfectly distinct, as the devil and his agent or agents. You yourself, Senhor, who, of course, as an orthodox and inveterate Catholic, must abhor the enemy of mankind, have often acted as his agent, and yet would be somewhat offended at being mistaken for him." Don Francisco crossed himself repeatedly, and devoutly disavowed his ever having been an agent of the enemy of man. "Will you dare to say so?" said his singular visitor, not raising his voice, as the insolence of the question seemed to require, but depressing it to the lowest whisper as he drew his seat nearer his astonished companion. "Will you dare to say so? Have you never erred? Have you never felt one impure sensation? Have you never indulged a transient feeling of hatred, or malice, or revenge? Have you never forgot to do the good you ought to do, or remembered to do the evil you ought not to have done? Have you never in trade overreached a dealer, or banqueted on the spoils of your starving debtor? Have you never, as you went to your daily devotions, cursed from your heart the wanderings of your heretical brethren, and while you dipped your fingers in the holy water, hoped that every drop that touched your pores would be visited on them in drops of brimstone and sulphur? Have you never, as you beheld the famished, illiterate, degraded populace of your country, exulted in the wretched and temporary superiority your wealth has given you, and felt that the wheels of your carriage would not roll less smoothly if the way was paved with the heads of your countrymen? Orthodox, Catholic, old Christian, as you boast yourself to be, is not this true? And dare you say you have not been an agent of Satan? I tell you, whenever you indulge one brutal passion, one sordid desire, one impure imagination, whenever you uttered one word that wrung the heart, or embittered the spirit of your fellow creature, whenever you made that hour pass in pain to whose flight you might have lent wings of down, whenever you have seen the tear, when your hand might have wiped away, fall uncaught, or forced it from an eye, which would have smiled on you in light had you permitted it, whenever you have done this, you have been 10 times more an agent of the enemy of man than all the wretches whom terror, enfeebled nerves, or visionary credulity has forced into the confession of an incredible compact with the author of evil, and whose confession has consigned them to flames much more substantial than those the imagination of their persecutors pictured them doomed to for an eternity of suffering. Enemy of mankind, the speaker continued, alas, how absurdly is that title bestowed on the great angelic chief, the morning star fallen from its sphere. What enemy has man so deadly as himself? If he would ask on whom he should bestow that title aright, let him smite his bosom, and his heart will answer, bestow it here. The emotion with which the stranger spoke roused and affected even the sluggish and encrusted spirit of the listener. His conscience, like a state coach-horse, had hitherto only been brought on solemn and pompous occasions, and then paced heavily along a smooth and well-prepared course under the gorgeous trappings of ceremony. Now it resembled the same animal suddenly bestrid by a fierce and vigorous rider, and urged by a lash and spur along a new and rugged road, and slow and reluctant as he was to own it, he felt the power of the weight that pressed, and the bit that galled him. He answered by a hasty and trembling renunciation of all engagements, direct or indirect, with the evil power, but he added that he must acknowledge he had been too often the victim of his seductions, and trusted for the forgiveness of his wanderings to the power of the Holy Church and the intercession of the saints. The stranger, though he smiled somewhat grimly at this declaration, seemed to accept the concession, and apologized in his turn for the warmth with which he had spoken, and which he begged Don Francisco would interpret as a mark of interest in his spiritual concerns. This explanation, though it seemed to commence favourably, was not followed, however, by any attempt at renewed conversation. The parties appeared to stand aloof from each other till the stranger again alluded to his having overheard the singular conversation and subsequent narrative in Aliaga's apartment. "Senhor," he added, in a voice whose solemnity deeply impressed the hearer, wearied as he was, "I am acquainted with circumstances relating to the extraordinary person who was the daily watcher of Walberg's miseries, and the nightly tempter of his thoughts, known but to him and me. Indeed, I may add, without the imputation of vanity or presumption, that I am as well acquainted as himself with every event of his extraordinary existence, and that your curiosity, if excited at all about him, could be gratified by none so amply and faithfully as by myself." "I thank you, Senhor," answered Don Francisco, whose blood seemed congealing in his veins at the voice and expression of the stranger, he knew not why. "I thank you, but my curiosity has been completely satisfied by the narrative I have already listened to. The night is far spent, and I have to pursue my journey tomorrow. I will therefore defer hearing the particulars you offer to gratify me with till our next meeting." As he spoke, he rose from his seat, hoping that this action would intimate to the intruder that his presence was no longer desirable. The latter continued, in spite of the intimation, fixed in his seat. At length, starting as if from a trance, he exclaimed, "When shall our next meeting be?" Don Francisco, who did not feel particularly anxious to renew the intimacy, slightly mentioned that he was on his journey to the neighbourhood of Madrid, where his family, whom he had not seen for many years, resided, that the stages of his journey were uncertain, as he would be obliged to wait for communications from a friend and future relative. He alluded to Montilla, his intended son-in-law, and as he spoke the stranger gave a peculiar smile, and also from certain mercantile correspondents, whose letters were of the utmost importance. Finally he added, in a disturbed tone, for the awe of the stranger's presence hung round him like a chilling atmosphere, and seemed to freeze even his words as they issued from his mouth, he could not easily tell when he might again have the honour of meeting the stranger. "You cannot," said the stranger, rising and drawing his mantle over one shoulder, while his reverted eyes glanced fearfully on the pale auditor, "you cannot, but I can. Don Francisco de Aliaga, we shall meet tomorrow night." As he spoke, he still continued to stand near the door, fixing on Aliaga eyes whose light seemed to burn more intensely amid the dimness of the wretched apartment. Aliaga had risen also, and was gazing on his strange visitor with dim and troubled vision, when the latter, suddenly retreating from the door, approached him and said, in a stifled and mysterious whisper, "Would you wish to witness the fate of those whose curiosity or presumption breaks on the secrets of that mysterious being, and dares to touch the folds of the veil in which his destiny has been enshrouded by eternity? If you do, look here." And as he spoke, he pointed to a door which Don Francisco well remembered to be that which the person whom he had met at the inn the preceding evening, and who had related to him the tale of Guzman's family, or rather relatives, had retired by. Obeying mechanically the waving of the arm and the beckoning of the stranger's awful eye, rather than the impulse of his own will, Aliaga followed him. They entered the apartment. It was narrow and dark and empty. The stranger held a candle aloft, whose dim light fell on a wretched bed, where lay what had been the form of a living man within a few hours. "Look there," said the stranger, and Aliaga, with horror, beheld the figure of the being who had been conversing with him the preceding part of that very evening, extended a course. "Advance, look, observe," said the stranger, tearing off the sheet which had been the only covering of the sleeper, who had now sunk into the long and last slumber. "There is no mark of violence, no distortion of feature or convulsion of limb. No hand of man was on him. He sought the possession of a desperate secret. He obtained it, but he paid for it the dreadful price that can be paid but once by mortals. So perish those whose presumption exceeds their power. Aliaga, as he beheld the body and heard the words of the stranger, felt himself disposed to summon the inmates of the house, and accuse the stranger of murder. But the natural cowardice of a mercantile spirit, mingled with other feelings which he could not analyze, and dared not own, withheld him, and he continued to gaze alternately on the corse and the corse-like stranger. The latter, after pointing emphatically to the body, as if intimating the danger of imprudent curiosity or unavailing disclosure, repeated the words, "We meet again to-morrow night," and departed. Aliaga, overcome by fatigue and emotion, sunk down by the corse, and remained in that trance-like state till the servants of the inn entered the room. They were shocked to find a dead body in the bed, and scarce less shocked at the death-like state in which they found Aliaga. His known wealth and distinction procured for him those attentions which otherwise their terrors or their suspicions might have withheld. A sheet was cast over the body, and Aliaga was conveyed to another apartment and attended sedulously by the domestics. In the meantime the Al-Qaeda arrived, and having learned that the person who had died suddenly in the inn was one totally unknown, as being only a writer and a man of no importance in public or private life, and that the person found near his bed in a passive stupor was a wealthy merchant, snatched with some trepidation the pen from the inkhorn which hung at his buttonhole, and sketched the record of this sapient inquest. That a guest had died in the house none could deny, but no one could suspect Don Francisco de Aliaga of murder. As Don Francisco mounted his mule the following day, on the strength of this just verdict, a person who did not apparently belong to the house was particularly solicitous in adjusting his stirrups, etc. And while the obsequious Al-Qaeda bowed often profoundly to the wealthy merchant, whose liberality he had amply experienced for the favourable colour he had given to the strong circumstantial evidence against him, this person whispered in a voice that reached only the ears of Don Francisco, "We meet to-night." Don Francisco checked his mule as he heard the words. He looked round him. The speaker was gone. Don Francisco rode on with a feeling known to few, and which those who have felt are perhaps the least willing to communicate. End of chapter 28, part 2.